and I'm going to examine the first line of evidence tonight, which we're going to cover, which is the eyewitness testimony. Now, have I got anyone here who's game enough to admit to watching Law and Order on the TV? Anyone? We have a few hands. Some a lot more enthusiastic than others. Nick down here is really enthusiastic. Maybe just because he's a newly married man. Could be doing. Okay, I find it's interesting to watch, for instance, in Law and Order, where the most compelling and climactic point in a trial seems to be when an eyewitness describes the crime that he or she has seen and then points confidently towards the perpetrator, the defendant, as being the perpetrator. And you have to admit that eyewitness testimony can be compelling and convincing when a witness has had ample opportunity to observe a crime, when their examination is truthful and fair. It can be seen that their testimony can be enough to condemn someone to prison or worse. And in the same way, eyewitness testimony is important in investigating historical matters. Okay, now in this investigation, essentially I want you to guys keep in mind 3 points that we're going to be looking at and to mull over. So the first one of which, what eyewitness accounts do we possess? The next one being, do we have the testimony of anyone who personally interacted with Jesus, who saw his teachings, saw his miracles, who encountered him after his alleged resurrection? And finally, do we have any records from first century journalists who actually interviewed eyewitnesses, asked the tough questions, and wrote down and recorded what they scrupulously determined to be true? So that's the 3 points we're going to have a look at. Getting in, let's just ask ourselves a major question. First of all, where do we find the Christmas story and the authors and major characters acquainted with that story? So let's have a look. Start of the New Testament, we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are 4 eyewitness testimonies, and they record the biographies of who? Anyone want to yell it out? Jesus. Excellent. We have some Sunday school graduates. Let's go. Okay, so we have the 4. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let's go on from there. So we have 4 names. So each one of these Gospels has a name. But traditionally, and there's no actual attribution in the Gospels, they don't have an introduction like Peter does. For instance, Paul, in his letters, where they say that they're written by the certain person. There's no authorship declared in the actual book itself. So then where do we get these names from? The early church, which is sort of the fathers on, so from the start of the church, we see start of Acts all the way through, we have uniform testimony that these 4 Gospels belong to 4 people. And incredibly, it's true, but the 4 people are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Seems to be a bit of a coincidence. Okay, but let's have a look at these 4 characters and see who they actually were and whether or not they are acquainted with Jesus. Now, the first Gospel we have is Matthew. Coming up on here. Now, Matthew is also known as Levi, the tax collector. He wasn't a very well-liked man, but he was one of the 12 disciples. So he spent 3 years with Jesus on his time here on earth. The second person we have is Mark, also known as John Mark. He was a companion both of Peter, who spent time with him, and also went on some missionary journeys with Paul and Barnabas. The next one we have is Luke. Now, Luke is who was described in Acts as Paul's beloved physician. So he's someone that went on a lot of missionary journeys with Paul. He wrote the book, both Luke and Acts. So it's a 2-part series. And finally, the last Gospel is written by John, the beloved disciple. So he was one of Jesus' inner 3 disciples, so spent a lot of time. So it's clear then, by quickly just having a look at these 4 Gospels, having a look at their authorship, that each one of them either was a witness or recorded eyewitness testimony to the life of Christ. So that's our first part answered. All right, let's move on to another question. Can we rely on the truthfulness of the Christmas story as recorded in the Gospels? Now, this is the big question. What is to say that the Gospel writers didn't just fabricate their reports to suit their own purposes? A very easy thing to do. They could have embellished on the truth behind the life of Christ. But I'm going to show you here, if I was an author and I was writing to fabricate a story, what I would claim as truth for my own purposes, I would have done a very bad job with the Gospels. So let's have a look. Now, raise your hand for me if you know what pseudonymity is, apart from a big word that helps me look smart. Okay, pseudonymity is a process by which someone would attribute authorship of their work to a much more well-known figure, so that it would gain credibility in authorship. For example, Craig already stole my thunder, but I'll use the moon landing. If I was to write a book saying that I was the first man on the moon and I detailed all the experiences, it wouldn't be very credible for a number of reasons. Firstly, I would find it very hard to reconcile being 400,000 kilometers above sea level with my fear of heights. So that's one. But more credibly, I've never been to the moon, as you all know, nor have I ever met anyone that has. I was born after 1969, the event, and I was not an eyewitness to the accounts, to the events that happened. So, for example, if I was to write that book, though, and attribute authorship to Neil Armstrong, it instantly gains more credibility. Understood? Okay. For another example, The apocryphal Gospels that are used in the Da Vinci Code are a good example of pseudonymity. They were written roughly about 150 AD and were attributed to figures such as Philip, Peter, Mary, Thomas, and James, who all died at least 50 years before they were written. So obviously they're not very credible. Now, apart from the Gospel of John, who was an intimate disciple of Jesus, the three names that were chosen, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are not the best names to choose if you're trying to give your work authenticity or credibility, because Mark and Luke weren't even disciples of Jesus. They were just people that spent time with him. And finally, Matthew, who was one of Jesus' disciples, he used to be a former hated tax collector. So he would have been the least likely person, the most infamous character next to Judas, who actually betrayed Jesus. So he wouldn't have been the best disciple's name to choose either. So moving on from there, though, the other question, the big question you really need to ask yourself, is that if the gospel writers did make up the story surrounding the life of Christ, why would they be willing to die in defense, or as a martyr in defense of the truth that they proclaimed? If we go back one slide, if we can. Here we have a picture of Peter. Now, Peter was, is well spoken in the Gospels, but Peter actually asked, when he faced martyrdom for the truth of the Gospels, that he might be crucified upside down, because he didn't feel that he was worthy enough to die in the same way as his Lord. So he asked to be crucified upside down in reverence of Jesus.